Okay, good evening to all of you. First of all, on behalf of Center for Bank Studies of Central Bank of Sri Lanka, let me warmly welcome all of you for the first public lecture in the year 2022. How can SMEs and startups navigate the post-pandemic business environment? This is going to be our topic today. So we have invited Mr. Talal Rafi, an international consultant, to deliver his thoughts on this. We warmly welcome you, Mr. Rafi. Yes.
Thank you.
So, yeah. And today we have been joined by a quite large crowd connecting with us via Zoom as well as Facebook. We are happy to have you here. We warmly welcome all of you as well. So today's speech will be followed by a Q&A session in which you can interact with us and direct your questions on the subject matter we discuss here today. You can send your questions and can interact with us through the Q&A option in Zoom. And if you're joining by Facebook, you can write your question as a comment in the Facebook post as well. So the rules stay very simple, just like in the previous sessions. Having those things cleared, let me now, without taking much time, invite the Deputy Governor of Central Bank of Sri Lanka, Mr. Mahinda Siriwardana, to deliver opening remarks for the lecture. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Kushan. Good evening. I would also like to warmly welcome you all for today's seminar on how can SMEs and startups navigate the post-pandemic business environment. We know that SMEs perform a strategic role in Sri Lanka. It accounts for a very high percentage of total number of industrial and business enterprises, as in other similar countries. Also, SMEs play an important role through generation of employment, contributing to the economic growth, embarking on innovation and stimulating other economic activities. Despite their importance, we know that SMEs face several challenges, including access to finance, low adoption of technology, and limited access to markets, etc. Considering the importance, the central bank is implementing several programs to support the MSMEs with measures including loan schemes and national financial inclusion strategy, which was launched by the central bank last year. At the same time, we know that startups are businesses that want to disrupt industries and change the world. And they are young companies founded to develop a unique product or service. So we have seen in the literature that there are differences in SMEs and startups, particularly in terms of the target market, business model and technology, talent, profitability, customer interface, employees, and types of financing, etc. So the COVID-19 pandemic has affected adversely on both SME sector as well as the startups globally. So given the importance of SMEs and startups continuing their operations in the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, at today's seminar, Mr. Talal Rafi expects to elaborate on these developments and opportunities and make several recommendations for them to navigate the post-pandemic business environment effectively. So with that very brief introduction, I would like to invite Mr. Kushan to introduce today's speaker, Mr. Talal Rafi. Over to you, Kushan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir, for setting the tone for the seminar. So without taking much time, let me spend a couple of minutes to introduce our speaker today. Mr. Talal Rafi is on Deloitte Global Team on climate and sustainability and is a member of the Global ESG Operations team at Deloitte Global. Apart from that, Mr. Rafi is serving as a member of the expert network of the World Economic Forum as well. Further, he is working with a number of global and local organizations in various capacities on areas including entrepreneurship as well as digitalization. And he has been contributing to various discussion forums as a panelist and speaker, and his work has been published in reputed platforms, including Forbes. So with that introduction, let me now invite Mr. Talal Rafi to commence his speech. Mr. Talal, screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Kushan. And first of all, my thanks to the Central Bank for inviting me. And it's truly a pleasure to speak here. And my thanks to the Deputy Governor, Mr. Sirivardhana, and Mrs. Samaratunga, the Director for the Center of Business Studies. So with that, just want to start this topic, SMEs and startups and how they can navigate. And as a whole, what are the conditions we need to put in to empower them further? Because as you know, the SMEs contribute around half of Sri Lanka's GDP, and the startup sector, as I will speak later on in my presentation, they are quite small, but they have the potential to grow very much higher. So with that, let me just share my screen. Yeah. Hope everyone can see it. So the topic is how can SMEs and startups navigate the post-pandemic business environment? But I will also speak on, for example, like what are the policies and other ecosystem infrastructure we need to put in place to spur better growth among the SMEs and the startup sectors. So with that, let me just start on and give a very brief overview of the SME sector. So the definition of an SME is very varied. Different organizations, different multilateral organizations, and different countries have different definitions. But the one used by the Ministry of Industry and Commerce a few years ago in their study says less than 300 employees and less than 750 million revenue a year. So with that, for example, when you look at Sri Lanka, the number of, when you break it down by employment, it comes to around 75% are employed by the SME sector. And the larger corporations employ around a quarter of the population. And so let me speak on the differences between the SME and the corporate sector. As we know, the definition is very simple. About 300 people employed would constitute a corporate, but there are also a number of very generalized differences between the two sectors. So if we can kind of tap into these sectors, these are some of the reasons why SMEs, in many cases, remain SMEs. So if we can like concentrate on breaking down and solving these problems, we can kind of push most of these SMEs into the larger category. So one of the first things that we find interesting is that, for example, SMEs are mainly focused on domestic markets. While when you look at, for example, the larger corporations, about 2/3 of them look into the export market or have some form of exporting in them. So that is a major key this thing, because when you look at the Sri Lankan market, when you're looking at concentrating on the domestic sector, it's only around $80 billion, the GDP. Like when you look at outside, it's much bigger and a wider market. So the second thing is that it's a bit, the governance is a bit informal. So most of the time, as you see, they're family run. So meetings are not held regularly. Once again, this is a bit of a generalization. So there are exceptions, but as a whole, the governance structure is a bit different between SMEs and the large corporations. The other thing is the SMEs also operate on much thinner margins. So this kind of affects them in a sort of a crisis when, especially like the pandemic recently. So where they are the first to struggle in most cases. And the last thing would be, for example, financials are not kept properly. So this is one of the complaints when I speak to the banking sector is that, you know, most of us want the banks to give on cash flow basis, but they say like, even when we are ready, the financials are not kept orderly for us to give these things. So this is one of the other things that I found is that they couldn't tap into things such as what the central bank gave, the moratoriums and others, because they were mostly in the informal sector. Let me just touch on a few things, like a few industries. Like, for example, the tourism industry has seen a peak, for example, in 2018. And when we look at that, around 500,000 were employed in the tourism sector. So directly and indirectly, according to the ILO. And the apparel sector, as we know, about 100,000 out of the 300,000 employees directly employed are from SMEs. And also the apparel sector indirectly employs around 600,000 people, of which one of the benefits is that 80% are women. So as somebody who works on gender equality, so this is an industry that we can tap into along with the ICT sector. And about 40% of MSMEs concentrate on the food sector. So that's also another key factor, with an estimate from the EDB showing that around 2 million people are involved directly and indirectly in this sector. So let me dive on to the startups. I'll just explain in the next slide why startups are essential. But before I dive in, let's just look at a few differences between SMEs and startups. As a whole, this is just, again, a sort of a generalization, but there are, this is how it is for overwhelming startups and SMEs, the differences. Most startups focus on digital solutions. You see a study, almost 96% of them have some sort of software development in them. So anyway, me as a founder of a startup co-working space, so that was an exception. With that, so the second difference would be startups usually need long-term investments, like, for example, prototyping, creating a minimum viable product, and others. So this kind of explains why startups generally don't go to banks or other things for loans. So most of the time they concentrate on VC firms and angel investors, and in once they're a bit grown, at private equity. So the other factor is that this also kind of explains that there's also sort of a risk when you look at investing in startups. One is that when compared to SMEs, the startups, the failure rate is very much higher. But at the same time, if investors pick the correct ones, the success rate is much higher. I mean, the growth scales are very much higher. In many cases, they can go like 10 times, 20 times the market value at the time it was time the VCs or anybody invested in them. The other thing is startups need generally an ecosystem. So again, a sort of a generalization, but most startup founders I interact with are product development specialists. So they need kind of like time to focus on that. So there has to be a sort of an ecosystem to develop that. Like, for example, VCs, the digital infrastructure, the legal, HR. So currently I serve on the Enterprise Operations Committee at Moratuwa University. So here under the World Bank Ahead project, we are doing exactly this area. So we have a sort of a university business linkage center where we are looking to provide them with, we are already doing that with legal service, HR, accounting, and other infrastructure. So moving on, incubators, accelerators, again, the same thing. So that's kind of a difference where most of the startups need incubators, especially founders with brilliant ideas who need to be given the platform to grow rapidly, and accelerators for startups that are very promising that need to accelerate and become much bigger. So mentoring, networking, and meeting up with potential investors. So these are very essential. And lastly, startups need talent, especially STEM graduates. So one of the things in Sri Lanka is that we currently put out around 5,000 STEM graduates a year. So out of that, 1,000 leave the country. So we're left with 4,000. So when you compare it with, for example, India, there's around 26 million STEM graduates coming out a year. I mean, India is a much larger population, but when you look at per million, India is producing around 5 times more STEM graduates. So if you're going to create a startup ecosystem or a more vibrant ICT Bpm industry, so we need more STEM graduates. So now this slide is quite important because right now the startup ecosystem, or as a whole, the value, it's a rough estimate, it's around $130 million. So that comes to less than a percentage. So when you compare to SMEs, SMEs constitute around half of Sri Lanka's GDP. So people might be thinking, I mean, it's not a time to concentrate on this sector, but startups, as the country is moving forward or the world is moving forward, they are going to become much bigger. So startups as a whole are very important for the medium term and even more important in the long term if we're going to grow as a country and become a high income country. So a very brief look at this chart would explain why. In the year 2001, if you see, General Electric was the largest, but then it's all still dominated by the oil companies and the banks. 2006, again, the oil companies dominate. Exxon is the highest. You find the bank there, and then you find the French oil company there. And when you move on to 2011, Exxon is still there, but then Apple comes second. But still the rest, like PetroChina, Shell, these are oil companies still sort of kind of dominating. But what is interesting is that if you look at 2016, it's just completely tech companies. These are all startups at some stage. So if you look at compare 2016, the companies there, Apple, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, Facebook. So in the year 2001, with the exception of, for example, Apple and Microsoft, the others like Google, Amazon were startups back then in 2001. Today, they're the largest companies. And Facebook did not even exist at that time. So this is something that's going to happen in Sri Lanka. So currently you see most of the stock market being dominated by a few conglomerates, but in the coming 10 to 15 years, it's a bit obvious that the tech companies are going to take over. Especially the pandemic has accelerated this trend. So just briefly touching on the startup ecosystem. So these are some of the things that are quite needed when it comes to creating a successful startup system. So first is university. So if you see the most successful startup ecosystems in the world, entrepreneurship ecosystems, it's Boston and Silicon Valley. So Boston is powered by MIT at the center and Silicon Valley by Stanford. So the universities play a key role in giving out talented graduates, and at the same time, it's also a place for research and development. And the other thing is angel investors are needed. So talking about universities, coming back to the earlier point, so this is something that we are trying to do with Moratuwa University. So as sort of an engineering university focused on that, we want to create a sort of an ecosystem around the university. So that's some development in Sri Lanka. So the other thing is angel investors and VCs are needed for a successful startup ecosystem. So one interesting thing we find is there's always a joke in Silicon Valley. It's that when you throw a stone there, there's a very high probability of hitting the head of an angel investor or a VC, a venture capitalist. So that's sort of something you need, because when you know there is a huge amount of or a supply of money being and people having the money looking to invest, it's going to encourage a lot of people to start businesses. And the other thing is support. As I mentioned, mentors, experts. So I'm always a big fan of mentors, because when I was working under a USAID project, I was instrumental in designing a mentoring platform for the country, especially towards empowering women and the youth. Because what we find is that SMEs or startups have a very high failure rate, but then the failure rate comes down by 40% with successful mentoring. So that's one factor. The other thing is, as I mentioned, incubators, accelerators are needed to give the support. And large corporations are also needed to give in the support, especially when it comes to investing, partnering, and other activities. Like, for example, when you look at large corporations, you find companies such as Google, or even Disney has its own accelerator program. So this is to encourage, I mean, most of the time, like these large corporations have their self-interest. They have these accelerators in industries, to come into industries which they are in, so that they can tap into innovation. Because as we know, the larger companies, as they grow bigger, the incentive or the ability to innovate is much less. So because of a lot of bureaucracy and other factors, but innovation usually comes right out of startups. Startups, by definition, are something that's looking to disrupt, as the Deputy Governor said. And lastly, as I mentioned again, so Moratuwa University, I just want to touch on this. So here we are currently under the World Bank's AHEAD project, have a sort of an incubator and an accelerator, something in between. So where we're encouraging a lot of startups to develop. So we have some very brilliant startups, some in IoT, AI to control traffic, and drone technology to scan a vast amount of agricultural land, and even to give data back. So these are some of the most brilliant ideas coming in. So what we do is we have a number of partners. For example, the World Bank is funding it, and others. So hopefully in future, our plan is to maybe in the next 10 to 15 years, grow this as a wider ecosystem. So I just want to speak about a couple of industries and also a focus on exports. So first, let me touch on one industry that has a lot of potential to grow. For example, the IT BPM industry. So BPM stands for Business Process Management. And so this industry, roughly around $1.5 billion, according to the source, whichever source you go into. And also the IT BPM industry has a lot of positives to bring in. For example, this is one industry that, according to studies, show that it can indirectly create 2.5 jobs for each job in this sector. So that is kind of one of the reasons is that because most of the earnings come in dollars from outside, and the employees are paid much higher. So again, what it means is that so as employees are paid much higher, there is a lot more money there for domestic consumption. So for example, entertainment or domestic tourism, financial services, the construction industry as they buy more houses. So this is one industry that we need to focus on, because SLASCOM says that by 2025, they will their revenue can hit around $5 billion. So, and we're also perfectly positioned for this. I mean, Sri Lanka is the first country in South Asia to test 5G. And when it comes to 4G coverage, we cover around 95% of the population. And just a few more stats. I mean, Sri Lanka, for example, when it comes to this sector, we have an amazing amount of talent. For example, from powering a global stock exchange to doing many other things. So we have some of the best talent in the world to do this. And I'm not exaggerating. The other thing is that ICT companies in Sri Lanka around over 600 and the BPM companies around 80, but these are fast growing. And the year-on-year cumulative annual growth for the IT BPM sector was 13% from 2013 to 2019. So this is much higher than the annual GDP growth of Sri Lanka. So this shows that a lot of more emphasis is needed to put into this sector. And for example, according to the ICTA and other studies, Sri Lanka mostly specializes in software product engineering, financial service outsourcing, and other niche technologies. And probably the most positive thing about the IT BPM industry is that the number of women working, the participation is increasing steadily. And for example, it's also the pandemic, though it's a very unfortunate event, it has sort of led to a lot of opportunities, especially in the digital sector. For example, the e-commerce sector has grown rapidly, a lot more people shopping online. The gig economy like Uber, PickMe, and other companies seeing massive growth as people order online, especially food items and others. And also remote working, EdTech. So I recently wrote a piece, for example, it was published by the International Monetary Fund on, for example, disabilities, people with disabilities. So one of the advantages that we find is that they're able to work from home and at the same time get education from the comfort of their home. So this is one of the positives about the positives that the pandemic has brought in, especially with new digital opportunities. And lastly, digital payments as well. With fintech and other things rising. So the second thing is that we need to tap into the green economy. So as I'm just biased to speak on this because I serve on the Deloitte Global Team on climate and sustainability. So one thing is that, as we know, the world is moving towards this. The Paris Climate Agreement and the Glasgow conference reaffirm this. So there is a worldwide global consensus on meeting climate targets. So this is one area Sri Lanka can position itself very clearly, and SMEs and startups can benefit greatly. So moving towards is needed not just for energy security, which we need because we are heavily reliant on fossil fuels, but also economic security. Like, for example, right now we see that about roughly around $300 million a month is being sent out, dollars are being sent out to get crude oil. So this is a huge burden on the foreign reserves we have at the moment. So if we had planned about 10 years ago to move in this direction heavily, the burden would have been much lesser right now. So this is a very high priority for Sri Lanka, especially when the sort of businesses are going to be more digital. We're going to need more energy coming in, especially with the government announcing the interest in this area. And as of now, the investment in sustainability itself has reached around $35 trillion, which is around 1/3 of the global investments. And till 2030, to meet climate goals, we need around $1 trillion a year in investments each year, with the developed countries promising a huge amount. So if we can position ourselves into a proper area to tap into this, especially we are very strong on amount of supply on solar and wind. So this would be a very good sector for Sri Lanka to tap into. And finally, we on the sectors that I think we need to concentrate on, we need to focus on increasing exports. As I mentioned, one of the reasons for SMEs being smaller is because they focus mostly on the domestic market, which is $80 billion, while most of the large corporates, about 2/3 of them have some sort of exporting. So the problem with SMEs is that not only do they concentrate on the domestic Sri Lankan market, but even like in specific regions, like for example, if you get a SME in Kurunegala, for example, they just stick to the northwestern province or the Kurunegala district. Some of them don't even make an attempt to tap into the western province, which has a very high percentage of spending power. So this is one of the issues, sort of like we need to export for SMEs, not just when I mean export outside the country, but also outside the local regions. Some areas we need to do is value addition, because one thing we find is that a lot of our products which are absolutely great, like for example, cinnamon, tea, many cases sent as raw materials. So some other country takes it, an example is Mexico, which takes a massive amount of Sri Lankan products, and they repackage it, rebrand it, and sell it off to the developed world, mostly the US and Europe. So if you can go into more value addition, that will be a good thing. And the other thing is free trade agreement. So I'm excuse me, 1 minute. So free trade agreements are a massive benefit. So most of the time we look at free trade agreements as something to look into importing, but it can also be used as an instrument for exporting. Like when you look at, for example, the example of Vietnam. Vietnam has 15 free trade agreements, while Sri Lanka only has 3. So Vietnam's export to GDP ratio is over 100%, while Sri Lanka's hovers around 20%. So what we find is that between the time year 2000 and 2015, Sri Lanka brought in only 7 new products to the export basket, which brought in a revenue of $100 million. While at the very same time, while we brought in 7 products, Vietnam brought in 48 new products, for example, which brought in $54 billion of revenue. So not only did they bring more products in, but also the products they brought in had a much higher export value. So this was one of the reasons, is because if you look at countries such as China, Thailand, Vietnam, they all, their dominant industry was the apparel industry, but they moved into manufacturing electronics and machinery. So this is something that we need to work on, and free trade agreements would help greatly in this way. The other thing is FDI, especially looking at tech transfer. An example is China in the 80s. What we found is that they specifically allowed foreign direct investment into sectors where they lacked the technical skills and the management skills. So the whole objective was to learn from the foreign companies and then set up their own companies, getting the ideas and the technology from the mostly the Western companies. So this has transformed China into a global manufacturing power. And the other thing is also country branding. So we need to kind of brand ourselves, not just on exporting quality, quantity, but also quality. Like, for example, the best examples are made in Germany or made in Japan. Very few people question when it's a product made in Germany, because we all subconsciously geared to think that when it's made in, for example, Germany or Japan, the product is good. So that's sort of like on that end would be great, useful, because I'm saying all this because at the beginning I said that SME is one of the reasons is because they concentrate most on the domestic market. So we need to focus them on exporting. And lastly, also consistent government policies are needed. Maybe go on to some of the challenges faced by SMEs. One of the challenges is that access to finance is a major challenge. Most of the SMEs are informal, so they cannot tap into cash flow based borrowing. So what they do is that most of the time it's asset-based borrowing, and most of the time, as we know that even before the pandemic, half of the SMEs has a failure rate of 50%. So most of them end up not just losing the business, but also losing their assets. The other thing is low adoption of technology. So if you see many of the SMEs, they are very slow to adopt technology. Like, for example, most of the accounts are done by hand or by paper. So these are certain areas of, for example, like communicating and others. So these are certain areas where there is a lot of potential to improve. So we need kind of digital transformation as well in these sectors, and limited access to market. For example, as I mentioned before, the ability to scale into other regions, not just exports, but other parts of the country as well. And finally, lack of entrepreneurial skills. So most of the times, it's like starting a business and they lack the other skills. Like, for example, networking. If you look at, for example, the entrepreneurs, like the startup sector, it's a bit better when it comes to networking. So the SME sector, the networking is a bit low. And so we need to kind of expand the chambers in the region as well. And other areas would be, for example, communication skills, the ability to management skills, financial skills, those are quite areas that are lacking. So the impact of COVID on SMEs. So major impacts would be a low amount of working capital. So that's one area because of the lower amount of business activities happening. Supply chain breakdown globally. So that's not just in Sri Lanka, but affected globally because the pandemic started in China and now it's quite spread. And now that the economy is, the global economy is starting back, there is a sort of most of the industries cannot cope with the demand. And also high freight charges. Lack of knowledge about government help, help from financial institutions. So there's a bit of help, but in many cases, what we find is that there's a lack of knowledge about these. And for example, the debt moratorium and that factor is that it's a very good initiative. When I speak to a lot of SMEs, it's a very positive thing, especially like delayed payments. But some of the things is that, for example, the amount has to be paid later. And two things: one, the informal sector cannot tap into this. The other thing is, like, for example, it doesn't have that much of an effect on the tourism sector because that hasn't been making much revenue or cash flow in recent times. The other thing is the unavailability of dollars to import. So that has been one factor. So and order cancellations. So this has so the inability sometimes to export because of a lack of supplies had meant order cancellations and sometimes affecting long-term relationships of exporters. So some of the actions that SMEs can take, for example, one thing is that what we advise a lot is that to have more financial literacy and discipline, to have bookkeeping. So this especially helps when it comes to tapping into, for example, cash flow based loans and others. So not only in tapping into money from financial institutions, but it also helps organizations grow. If there is a sort of a discipline and understanding of what's happening, how much we have, how much we can spend, and other things. The second thing would be market research. What we find is that a lot of SMEs, for example, start a business without doing much research. Many of the times when I speak, one of the reasons they say they started a business is because somebody else, for example, had the business there. An example was speaking to someone, for example, the travel agents. So one person starts something, does extremely well, and then a few others follow in that direction. The market gets saturated, and in the end, most of them fail. So one thing is that market research is you need to find out, is there a demand in the thing? Who are the competitors? By how much can you grow? How much credit period is needed to run a business? Because most of the time it could be B2B, and in Sri Lanka we have a culture of giving credits, money on credit. And the other thing is also external advice. So this is something that smaller businesses need. So recently, I also wrote a piece for Forbes where one of the things is that the focus on, for example, having independent directors. So this is for a bit larger companies, such as medium scale companies, or at the same time, having some outsider to advise the company. Because when you bring in somebody from outside, it always helps with a sort of discipline. So most of the time, the SMEs are run by families. So there is a sort of a lack of discipline. So this is not the case for everyone. This is a bit of a sort of a generalization for the majority. And finally, coming on to a general recommendations at a more macroeconomic level. So most of the time when people speak about entrepreneurship, it's about, for example, the pillars are varied. Some have 10, some have 3. But here I'm just going to speak about the 6 pillars. So, for example, the first thing would be better policies are needed for SMEs and startups. One thing is ease of doing business. So that's one area we need to work on. As being an entrepreneur myself, so this is an area that's a bit important, or as I would know, much more important. So when it comes to ease of doing business in the World Bank's ranking, we rank at around 99th in the world. So we need to, especially there are 2 areas, for example, registering a business. So the country which ranks #1 according to the World Bank is New Zealand. So New Zealand, it takes half a day to register, and most of the information is found in a web page. So when you compare it to, for example, Sri Lanka, it takes around minimum 2 weeks. So though it can in some cases go beyond that. And another important factor that many people or many researchers leave out is the importance of the ease of closing a business. Like many people who work with like foreigners or bring in investment or starting a business usually tend to register a limited liability company. And one of the things is that it's very much harder to close a business when compared to starting a business. It can take, in many cases, in rough estimates, over 6 months to close, and there is a lot of hassle involved. So if the process can be improved when it comes to closing a business, a lot more people will find it, will be less reluctant to register companies. And at the same time, this will also encourage more people to get into the formal sector. So this is one area that we need to work on. The other thing is legal enforcement of contracts. So when it comes to the World Bank's ease of doing business, we rank at around 162nd in the world, especially on law enforcement of business contracts. So the World Bank report shows that even in a court in Colombo, it takes around 4 years to solve a legal dispute when it comes to business contracts. So these are some areas where there is a need to improve. The other thing is land loss. This greatly helps the businesses, because one thing you find is that when compared to the rest of the region, the Sri Lankan government owns a much higher percentage of land. So a couple of disadvantages with that is that most private, like SMEs or businessmen, lease the land out from the government. So there are two disadvantages here. One is that since the land is being leased and it's not in their name, they cannot use it as a collateral to get money. The second thing is, as the land is not theirs and it's the government land, they don't tend to take good care of the land. So these are two factors which we need to work on. For example, giving out more land. So recently the budget, they spoke about giving out land from the railway department, which is a very positive thing. And the other thing is labor laws. So as we know, one example would be, as I mentioned, the ICT sector is expanding very rapidly. According to SLASCOM, by 2025 could hit $5 billion in revenue. But one of the things is that, for example, there are laws like how women cannot work late at night. So with this, also we know that, especially in that sector, what we find is that most of the work is, in many cases, could be done remotely. So a bit of amendments in that would be helpful. And last thing is also more focus on research and development. So when you look at, for example, Switzerland ranks #1 when it comes to global innovation. So being the most innovative country. So one of the key factors is that there are two things. One is that the government does not get involved too deeply in this. And the second thing is that there is always a sort of an alliance geared by the government for the universities, the corporate sector, and startups to work together. So the universities happen to be like the place where the ideas come in, the startups are the people who implement those ideas, and the corporates are the ones who fund it. So it's a bit like everybody wins there. Again, speaking about the second pillar would be finance. So access to finance, I've spoken about that, a massive need on cash flow based lending. So again, we cannot blame the banks entirely. So the business people also have to, for example, in many cases, get their accounts in order. And the other thing is angel investors, venture capitalists. These are very essential, especially for the startup sector. As I mentioned, showing the example of the US, the startup ecosystem is set to expand very rapidly in the coming years or the coming couple of decades. And also about sweat equity. So this is one area we need to, which is essential when it comes to startups. Like, for example, one thing is that startups face a major challenge. Especially when it comes to acquiring talent, because most of the people, like they need to hire not just normal talent, but people who already are in good jobs in the corporate sector or in the government sector, and trying to get them to move away from such a secure job and move into a startup which has a very high failure rate requires these employees to be paid a bit higher, or in many cases much higher. So, and startups already are cash strapped. So one of the ways that this is done, especially in global ecosystems such as Silicon Valley, is sweat equity. So instead of paying them in rupees or dollars, they are paid in equity terms. So for working for a certain amount of period, they're given a percentage or ownership of the company after they complete that. So regulations related to these have to be made, especially to help the startup sector. The other thing is, for example, access to market, we need to focus more on digitization. Now there's a lot in the gig economy. E-commerce is booming, so SMEs especially should look into this option to grow their businesses, and many are. So, and also when it comes to exporting, to tap into, like, for example, a lot of number of international conferences happening digitally, and at the same time, features such as many exporters I know tend to find buyers via LinkedIn and other online sources. So especially a need on this is needed. And as I've already mentioned, the importance of free trade agreements. Like, for example, if you have that, it's not just for increasing trade, but also for foreign direct investment. So many larger companies want to set up a business or invest here so that they can tap into another market. For example, a market of $80 billion may not be that attractive, but if we have more FTAs with other countries, so it could be a more lucrative thing, especially when it comes to, even if Sri Lanka has to add only a tiny percent of value addition. So one example would be, for example, Apple. For example, only 7% of the value addition is done in China, but 43 components are brought from abroad. But this value addition of 7% creates 1.3 million jobs in China. So these small areas, niche places in the global supply chain can benefit us greatly. And also entrepreneurship networks. As I mentioned earlier, startups have much closer networks here, though there is area to improve, but SMEs need to work more to collaborate. So there is a lot of areas to collaborate. The chambers are doing well, but we need much greater collaboration on a national scale. And then moving on to, for example, human capital. As I mentioned, we need to focus more on STEM education. As I said, only 5,000 STEM graduates coming in. So even out of that, around 1,000 leave. So this is one area we need to work on. So that's one thing. I'm personally designing entrepreneurship curricula for Moratuwa University. And one of the things we've added is a focus on, especially on creativity and moving away from rote-based learning. So basically like listening to whatever the lecturer or teacher does and putting it on paper. So we need more creativity and open talent movement. If there's a less supply of STEM graduates, we need to make process possible so that we can get talent, especially from neighboring countries, until we have the enough human resources available here. Digital skills, again, important, as I mentioned before. And lastly, also 21st century skills. And what I mean is that I recently wrote a piece in partnership with an expert from the ADB for the London School of Economics, where I've spoken about the importance of 21st century skills, especially for gender. But as a whole, we also need this for SMEs, like, for example, communications, creativity, critical thinking, and collaboration. Especially collaboration and communications are very important. And also speaking about infrastructure, the other pillar is that energy supplies, transportation networks, all essential for SMEs, incubators, accelerators, as I spoke before, in the case of startups, digital infrastructure is needed, and we are doing quite well as the first country in South Asia to test 5G and 95% of the population having access to 4G. And support professionals like legal, accounting, investors, and we need a lot of investment bankers and VC firms as well. And lastly, I want to speak on culture. So this is one area we need to work on. For example, when it comes to Sri Lanka, only 3% of the population are entrepreneurs. This is extremely low and not sustainable in the long term. Because when you look at a country such as Bangladesh, 12% of the population are entrepreneurs. And Vietnam, Thailand, the amount goes up to 20%. So it just means that as most of the taxes are paid by entrepreneurs or companies created by entrepreneurs, having 3% is not, it's an amount that needs to be improved. So some of the factors are that the social status of entrepreneurs is quite low in Sri Lanka, because generally when I speak to a lot of people, there's sort of a stigma against going into entrepreneurship. Many parents expect their children to do well in school and work for the government or work for a private large corporation and rise up the ranks. So this is generally considered the good career path by parents. So kind of change in this area is needed. And also innovation and creativity. So we need to, as the world is changing very fast, even for not only for startups and SMEs, but also for large corporations. what we find is that the corporate lifespan of a company in 1914 was 90 years. So right now it's come as low as around 10 years, according to a study by McKinsey. So a lot of the larger businesses are going to be disrupted by startups. And finally, we also need visible success stories. As I mentioned, there's a sort of a negative thing against becoming entrepreneurs. So we need to kind of showcase entrepreneurs as role models, especially women entrepreneurs, to encourage more people to come into this field. So with that, thank you very much, and happy to have any questions.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Talal, for that wonderful presentation. And now we are ready for a couple of questions within the given time frame we have. The first thing comes from these financing options. Now, you mentioned, especially these startups, they need sort of long-term funding. And when they try to acquire funds through regular channels, just as banks and finance companies, the basic question that they would be having is the lack of assets. Normally, what will happen is they just look into assets. But startups, they just might be only having a gross idea. That's how they start up. So how this can be solved? You mentioned certain options like capital and everything. So what sort of solutions you can elaborate on that?
Yes. Yes. So there is also, as I mentioned before, startups have this trouble, especially this issue for SMEs as well. When it comes to borrowing, it's mostly like the banks ask for assets. So at the same time, when speaking to the banks also, I can kind of understand the issues as they are also answerable to people who deposit there. So one thing when I spoke to a banker, a very prominent banker, was that he said that when people invest in venture capitals or, for example, other private equity firms, they know the risk. So they know that it's going to be invested at a startup and the startup could fail. But at the same time, 1 in 10 startup could become extremely big or even a unicorn, and then they could get their cash in. So most of the people who put their money into a VC or a private equity firm know the risks. So they are investing. So what he told me was that the banks, most of the people who deposit in banks are the normal people who just want an interest rate of around 10 to 12%. So when taking their money and, for example, investing in a startup, and if the startups, for example, investing in 5 and all 5 go wrong, which is a probability, then they are answerable to their customers. So this is one area. But other thing is that, as I mentioned, it's also very difficult for startups to get money from banks, because as a definition, startups generally take a very long period to even not just even make profits, but to even make revenue. Because from the time they're given, they take around 3 to 4 years of sometimes prototyping, developing the product, making it, testing it out in a market, coming back. And so it's most of the time it's beyond the bank's thing to give money to them because of the very extremely high grace periods that are needed. So this is where most of the funding comes from, angel investors and others. So if you look at most of the startups, even in Sri Lanka, a very high percentage of them work on getting either their own money or money from their family and others, and a bit of angel investors who are very willing to invest at the very beginning. So, but speaking about the banks, we also need to, like, though I understand their problems, there is a sort of a change happening in this area as well. So if you look at, for example, major players such as major corporations, they are all looking at the importance of having their own incubators and accelerators. Large companies such as, for example, Google or even Disney. For example, Google has a thing where an employee is given 20% of the time to try something, just anything that can fail at the same time. So the banks need to understand that, as large corporations are doing, if a proper place is done to study the startups properly, and not just like give them a loan or give them a very high, one important condition is that startups need very long grace periods, and if banks are willing to have that grace period and to give that, not just to lend the money and just sit back, but if all the other things, like, for example, mentoring, advice, linking them with a wider network of supporters or additional investors, if all these can be done, for example, it would be a very good option for banks to look into investing in startups. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Talal. So, as I mentioned earlier, you can post your questions in Q&A column and as well as in the FB page. So now stemming from a question raised by Mr. Varun there regarding the labor availability. Now, there are certain sectors in the economy, be it and manufacturing. Entrepreneur might or a manufacturer might face with the problem of whether we should import the labor or whether we should try and train locals. And there are certain circumstances where the labor might not be available within the country. In that case, we need to go for an import solution. So how we can draw the line in this sphere? What are the solutions you can suggest?
Right. Thank you. That's a important question. As I mentioned earlier in my talk, for example, especially when it comes to a very important factor such as when you look at manufacturing and others, it's going to be a bit of an issue. But at the same time, it's also because either it's if there are no, I mean, when you speak to some sectors, they have lack of human capital. So one idea is ideally going to be like either we have to bring people from abroad or we need to, for example, move more into automation. So that means like these companies are just going to get more money from investors and automate. So basically like these jobs are going to be lost anyways, which is what is happening very widely. According to some studies, like for example, McKinsey predicted a few years ago that by 2030, 700 million jobs would be lost. But as I mentioned earlier, even for the startups, this is something that's very important. Like for example, when you look at per million, as I mentioned, India produces around 5 times more STEM graduates. So there's a huge amount of importance in this. So this is because STEM means, for those not aware, it's science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So people in that field. And this is something that's quite important because, for example, out of the 200,000 people coming out, finishing their A-levels, only around 40,000 get into state universities. And even when you look at that, some of them go into art streams and others. So the number going into STEM education is quite low. So like I said, we only produce even per million 1/5 of what India does. So right now, even sometimes it's a bit difficult, but in the coming future, there's going to be a huge need. So as I mentioned, to draw the line, it would be like till we get the amount of people here, it's going to be some sort of, we need to have agreements so that we can have workers from abroad working on visa arrangements. That would be very helpful because that is something that a lot of countries do. And these are studies that, for example, when you look at a number of countries, these have helped them greatly. For example, if you look at countries such as Korea, the example of countries in Southeast Asia, how the garment industry, for example, started there was because most of them went abroad, studied there, or worked in other garment factories, brought the ideas back and started it. So it's always a bit about also the other way. So when you bring in talent, for example, from abroad, you learn from their management skills. Like different organizations have different countries have different cultures from which you can learn a lot. So as I mentioned, this was a very good example of how the Chinese looked at FDI in the 1980s. So they did not really at that time care about the money being brought in. Their primary goal was to bring in investments and also skilled labor that came from the West to manage the organizations, the technical skills, the technology brought in. And what they did was study that, and most of the people who leave that start their own businesses. Like, for example, if you look at very positive is like HCL coming in with 1,000 employees. And if you look at, for example, Tesla, companies that are starting or the rivals of Tesla are mostly ex-employees of Tesla. So what we look at is that not to see people who are coming in from abroad, the foreign labor coming in to here to work it as a competition, because it is not a competition. The only reason they're coming into the country is because we don't have the skills at the moment to meet that, or we don't have the supply to meet the demand. So once the supply is met, they will go back, and at the same time, we can learn a lot from them. Hope that answers.
Yes, of course, Stella. So now we have a question again from Mr. Rafi. It's regarding FTAs, trade agreements, and like he's asking whether should we be focusing on FTAs more, or should we be looking into hand-holding schemes, just like Malaysia did? What sort of thing we should be looking into if we are to really encourage exports?
for example, one thing when you look at FTAs is that it opens up the country to not just because many things when you look at in Sri Lanka, in a Sri Lankan context, when you look at FTAs, most of the time it's about importing. People talk about like another country flooding in their products into our things, but also there is this advantage about utilizing the FTAs for exports. Like we have FTAs with India, Pakistan, and Singapore. But one thing is that, for example, with India, there are so many products on that list where we can import to India without much hassle. So this thing has not been tapped into. And also the thing about FTAs is that if you look at countries such as Switzerland or Singapore, they have very high export to GDP ratio. But at the same time, their import to GDP ratio is also higher, very higher. So it's just a thing about like more trade. And also the thing about importing is that if you look at, for example, PETA, there's an entire region or a sector that thrives on importing as well. So importing and exporting kind of helps in both ways. And as I mentioned, it's also like when you open it up for trade, it leads to innovation. The other thing is that keeping most of our industries protected will also mean that they will not be able to, for example, not going into FTAs or keeping import tariffs very high I agree that it will help our local industries be protected, but they can only with their protection go into the domestic market. They can be dominant in the domestic market. No foreigners are coming to take away their market share. They're happy, but they're unable to export. But as I mentioned, if we are going to develop as a country, we need to export because $80 billion is not enough to grow. So we need to look at exporting. And one thing about FTAs and bring in, for example, foreign direct investment or foreign companies to also come in and play a role, or importing foreign, allowing major global organizations to import, is that it will also make our existing organizations to become more innovative and competitive. And not just will they survive better in Sri Lanka, but they can also compete and find markets for their products abroad.
Thank you, Talal. Can we have 2 more questions? Is it possible?
Yes, sure.
Yeah, very sure.
Yeah.
Now, there's a question from Bino De Silva. It's regarding these micro enterprises and freelancers. Now, with the COVID now, we have seen a lot of freelancers coming on surface and do their work. So don't you think that these micro enterprises and freelancers have a collective chance to attract more export revenues in the future with emerging gig economy and the ability to work from home? How can we promote such exports in professional services? What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, I mean, the pandemic itself has led to a huge amount of opportunities, especially to work abroad. Like me, myself, as an example, like, for example, because of the whole remote working and others, I was able to work with, for example, Chatham House or help out with the ADB, the Manila team on their startup challenges. And also even currently with Deloitte, most of the team is in the US, but working remotely. So this has led to a huge opportunity, especially for our talent to tap into there. And this is also a sort of a avenue for getting much needed dollars. So some areas would be that, though, I mean, this is from my personal experience. I know a few people from, especially outside Colombo, they are like, we use them for software development, but the problem is that 2 areas are needed for that. One is like, we need to improve them on the digital marketing area. So how they can utilize things such as LinkedIn and others to find people or to market themselves better, and other sites. And at the same time, also focus more on the English language, because that's one of the key things, especially when it comes to communicating and finding clients outside. So with these things, I think that we can tap into a whole other things. But at the same time, also what we find is that there are a number of events happening online. So you see, almost on a daily basis, we find speakers, people to work together. So this is something that, I mean, it was in discussion. I was on working with the World Bank, me and a person from the World Bank HQ, we were discussing on creating a sort of a networking thing, which would help, especially in this. But due to the pandemic, the plan has got delayed a bit, but hopefully it works out.
Yes, thank you, Talal. And this question is from Dr. Travis Pereira. He's asking, what is your idea and experience in the principle of lean startup in order to evolve a viable business model and minimize failures?
So that thing would be, for example, I'm not a big expert on that area, but it's mostly, I would say that from the little knowledge I have, one area would be like when I speak to people, it's more to get in, for example, foreign expertise on that area. So that is something like, for example, how SLT got the management from the Japanese, or how Sri Lankan Airlines. So generally bringing in skills from abroad that can sort of lead to a much, for example, leaner system. So it's mostly tapping into that, but I would like to admit that that is not an area that I focus on mostly. Right.
Okay, thank you, Talal. The final question about yourself. You yourself mentioned you as an entrepreneur. So what sort of experience you can tell the audience regarding the journey you had?
Right.
By your key takeaways.
Right. Okay. So always happy to share that. So after returning from the UK, I was like, when coming back, we dived deep into entrepreneurship. So it was sort of a thing where we tried digital marketing, organic foods, and others. So organic foods, the president is doing a big drive on that. So we were focusing on that a few years ago as well. The other thing was, one thing was setting up the co-working space. So it was sort of a big challenge back then. So how there was sort of what we found was that to start a business, how we did was we were looking at a number of places for office spaces. So what we found was that it was a big hassle. So we had to deal with landlords, utilities, other things. But then what we found was that then we had a stop and thought, why not try to solve this problem of this thing? So why not create an office space where a customer does not have to go through all this hassle about getting internet lines, telephone lines, furniture, utilities, everything else. So what we wanted to do was have a space where they can walk into an office, and within an hour, they'll have their own space. If they want one or four, or even a cubicle with 10 to this thing. So that was my sort of an experience, I would say, of entrepreneurship, where we were looking to solve a problem in the country. But being an entrepreneur has helped me greatly to understand this, because it's always a sort of a journey where you like kind of fall off a cliff, but at the same time, while you're falling off, you have to find your way before you hit the ground. So in many cases, it's always something that you have to be prepared for two things. One is that you have to be prepared for a lot of rejections. So that's something that you don't get, because when you work for a professional organization, the only time you get rejected is at an interview at the beginning. But after you get into a job, if you get rejected, it's most probably you think that your organization got rejected. But when you're an entrepreneur, people will say things or turn you down to your face. So that's something you need. And the other thing is that it's always about what I would advise for entrepreneurs is always about regret. Like how Jeff Bezos says, when you're 80 years old, you don't want to be thinking back and saying that I didn't try this or that. So if you really are passionate about doing something, for example, disrupting something or changing an industry, starting a startup that could change not just Sri Lanka, but the world, then go for it, because it's always better to, try 100 times and fail rather than not try something and regret it later on. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Talal. We had an interesting Q&A session, and I should be thankful for all of you for the active engagement for this discussion and for the answers provided by Mr. Talal. So in the best interest of time, we have to conclude the Q&A session. And finally, on behalf of the Central Bank space, let me thank Deputy Governor of Central Bank of Sri Lanka, Mr. Mahin Siddivardana, for joining this session to deliver opening remarks. And also to Mr. Talal Rafi for joining the session as a speaker and giving some valuable thoughts and eye-opening remarks as well. And also we should thank the audience too for the active engagement, as I mentioned earlier. With that, we have come to the end of today's webinar. Thank you very much to all of you who tuned into us and joined with us today. We will meet again soon with another interesting topic. That's the plan. So thank you once again, and good evening.